Welcome to Breaking the Echo Chamber podcast. I'm Manuel da Costa, the founder of Efestra, and this is the experimentation podcast for people who actually do the work. Not the glossy conference version, not the vendor success theater, but the messy reality of building experimentation programs that survive beyond the pilot phase. Each week, we'll explore the gaps between what gets celebrated online and at conferences and what actually drives sustainable results. This podcast is all about breaking the myths that persist in this industry and keep the experimentation industry back from achieving its true potential. Now, some episodes will be my take on where the industry is broken. Others will feature leaders who've learned to see past the noise. So if you're ready to hear what experimentation looks like when nobody's trying to sell you something, you're in the right place. Now, on to our episode. Welcome to today's show. My name is Manuel da Costa, the founder of Efestra, the experimentation governance platform. And today on the podcast, we welcome Mark Palfreeman, the Senior Business Intelligence Manager at Flutter UK. Welcome, Mark. Nice to have you on.
Hi, Manuel. Good to see you.
Thanks for joining. So the reason I got in touch with you in the first place, Mark, was I'd come across a post from someone else who had attended your talk at Experimentation London, was it, a few weeks ago?
Yeah, that's right.
And the title of that talk caught my attention, which was the anti-culture of experimentation. The reason being because I've been kind of quite vocal about how this term culture of experimentation is really vague and really undefined, and people latch onto different things when they talk about culture. So without giving too much away, I want to firstly focus on that talk that you gave. But before we do that, firstly, could you quickly introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a Senior Business Intelligence Manager here at Flutter UK and I. For those who don't know Flutter that well, we are a gambling or a gaming business. So it encompasses brands like Sky Bet, Paddy Power, Betfair. And my team works with a lot of the product teams across the business, really analysing and working with them around experimentation. So that's primarily what I'm doing here at Flutter. I'm also a co-founder of Experimentation North, which is similar to Experimentation London. It's a meetup event based in the north of England where we're trying to shift the culture from London a little bit and make sure that there's something up north for people who are based around Manchester and Leeds.
Yeah, there's definitely quite a big presence of experimentation folk up this way as well. So it's always good to have that kind of meeting of minds up this way as well. So, well, thanks for joining. And as I said, I'm really interested in that talk you gave. So do you want to summarize your viewpoints about this anti-culture of experimentation?
Yes, I mean, well, I will admit that there was a bit of a hook in the title. The title was Rejecting a Culture of Experimentation because I knew it would at least prick people's ears up, which it has done on social media, which is great. But the angle that I came at was effectively the culture of experimentation is what we should strive for. However, it means different things to different people. And a lot of businesses think that a culture of experimentation means they're doing lots of experiments. And really, you're probably missing the point and you're probably not getting the most out of experimentation if that is what a culture of experimentation means to you. So what I was trying to propose was reframing that to be a culture of learning for two reasons. First of all, as an experimentation program, if you're learning, then that's more effective as a sort of culture of experimentation. But also there's a lot of things you require for a culture of experimentation, such as you might require tooling, the right people in your organization, the right mindset, data literate people, things like that. And actually, to begin learning, you don't require any of that. So a culture of learning can be, I like to use the term gateway drug into a culture of experimentation because it's something that people can strive for. Everyone has a thirst for learning. And if you can get the entire organization wanting to learn more about their products and their customers, then that kind of mindset naturally evokes a culture of experimentation. Gets you halfway there, essentially.
I like the point that you make about you need a mindset. And again, mindset is one of those words that's been pushed about, oh, we need to create this mindset for experimentation and stuff. But it's easier said than done. And in your case, you're talking about learnings rather than um, building this culture, which is quite a different shift. And I actually like that approach because one thing I found when people talk about culture of experimentation, it's always something along the lines of we went from 5 experiments to 50 experiments, or we went from 0 to 100, or whatever that is. It's a velocity metric that they've attributed to culture of experimentation. Or even to a point where I remember asking someone, does your organization have that culture? And they're like, yeah, we bought StatSig or we bought Optimizely or something. So we must have a culture of experimentation.
And I come from the analyst point of view, right? So I'm naturally inquisitive. That's how you have to be an analyst, and you naturally have to want to learn things from the data and learn how people are using our products. But experimentation inevitably encompasses product, tech. Now, tech people don't have that same natural inquisitiveness for learning that I do as an analyst. They have a natural desire to deliver, and therefore velocity of experiments for them is a much more tangible way of saying, yes, we're experimenting because we've done X, Y, Z. I mean, you've got to remember, these are teams which are working through Jira, looking at velocity of tickets. It's natural that they're going to be looking at velocity of experiments when it comes to experimentation. Now, that's not to say that they're not interested in learning. It's just that if you put something in front of that group of people, the way they're going to succeed in doing that is doing a lot of it and doing it quicker. And tools like StatSig and a lot of these tools, they're fantastic tools. But what we're doing is we are speeding up whatever culture is in that business. Very few of them are actually moving to that culture of learning. They help a little bit. But if you've got a business that is struggling with velocity, StatSig doesn't enable them to rethink about how they're doing experiments. It helps them get faster in terms of velocity. So it's kind of a little bit dangerous in terms of the vendors and the agencies at times, because for them to get money, they need to enable the business to do what the business is doing. And the business is looking at it going, well, what we're trying to do is do lots of this thing. And nobody's going, well, hang on a second. You don't want to do lots of that thing. You want to do lots of this thing. See what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if testing vendors have kind of, you know, with my tinfoil hat on now, overinflated their use, right? They're definitely useful. They obviously enable experimentation and the complex mechanisms that's required to run those tests. But every time I see a testing vendor talking about experimentation, they just talk about how they can enable companies to run more experiments faster, quicker, and democratize testing. But essentially, all that it seems to be doing is it's democratizing chaos and scaling bad practices sometimes, especially if you don't have the infrastructure to get people running tests the right way. So if you just latch onto a velocity metric, you've just got more of rubbish going out, right?
100%. What you're doing is you're giving guns to people in the Wild West. That's exactly what you're doing with your tool.
Yeah.
Instead of having the people who know what they're doing in this space to be able to enable them to go faster, you're saying, well, everyone should be able to go faster. Now, there's an interesting fine line here, because you don't want the power of experimentation in a small, select few who understand statistics and do things in the right way. Experimentation can only work if it is democratized and everyone in the business can do it. But to be able to do that, you don't just plonk a tool in front of them. You need to make sure, I'm going to use the term mindset again, but you have to make sure that mindset is right so that the tool enables the right things.
Absolutely. And I think that's crucial because quite often when you see people have got access to tools and they're running what they think are experiments, but any person that's experienced in it can look at it and say, actually, that's not really an experiment. You've not designed it correctly, or the hypothesis was not strong enough. How do you counter things like that Or how would you advise people to counter things like that?
I think process is king, and it's not sexy. Nobody enjoys process, but things like metric frameworks mean that people are going after the right things, understanding how frameworks link into goals and things like that. Again, from the analyst point of view, one of the hardest things that we do is working with lots of different teams of lots of different goals, and if they're pivoting for different metrics every time, then it's really tough as an analyst because you're basically starting from scratch every time in terms of what you're looking at. Once you've got a framework in place, then it's getting people under the same umbrella. From an analyst point of view, it's the same piece of code, it's the same dashboards, all that sort of stuff. So process means that you should be quite rigid to start with. I'm a big fan that sort of really squeeze people. And in modern day culture and in modern day business, then I think that's tricky because everyone wants autonomy
Mm.
and businesses want to say, we're giving you as much autonomy as possible to do whatever you want. Now, I actually think in this world, you want to start really tight and then work it out as people understand what they're doing. But I think if you don't start tight, that's where the chaos comes from. I always take the view of I see it as sort of a contextual tent that everybody is under. And I feel like I spend a lot of my time watching people escape out of this tent. And once they're out of the tent, we don't have any control over the metrics they're using, how they're running experiments, what statistical methodologies they're using. And just keeping everybody under that tent so we can align it all is really how we want to move forward.
I really like that analogy, first of all, but I think I'm also aligned with your way of thinking. Quite often, I've heard talks from people that say, let people run experiments however they want, let them run bad tests, and so on and so forth. But if you don't have any guardrails defining how experiments should be run, you're essentially setting them up for failure in the long run because those bad practices they get embedded, and it's really hard to unpick it after a certain amount of time.
You're also setting them up for failure in a different type because people who don't understand what you're trying to achieve as a discovery mechanism, as a methodology of insight generation, just think that a test that loses is a reflection on them and they've had a bad idea. And therefore, they get disheartened with the idea of experimentation because they think it's a way that they can make an impact. And they're not making an impact. Therefore, experimentation isn't really working. And I think that culture of learning that we started with is really important because the people doing the experiments have to understand the value of learning from failure as well as success
Yeah.
so that every experiment they run they are benefiting from in some way, whether it's a win or a lose. Even, I mean, arguably properly failed tests, as in badly executed experiments, they're the ones that I always cringe a little bit. But even that, the people who have executed it incorrectly should have learned from the way they've executed it to make sure that it can be better going forward.
Absolutely. And I think this again goes back to these loops that I feel the industry is caught in. This industry has kind of matured over the last 15 years that I've been in it. And even now, it's just like the organizations running more and more experiments. But what I feel is that there is this fixation on a couple of things, the activity metrics, velocity, which we talked about. But then the other thing, this binary concept of win or lose. And that itself sets the experimentation programs up for failure because then you've got this myopic view that an experiment is only good, or an analyst or a experimentation specialist is only good if they deliver winning tests. And if they lose, they're not good. And then there's this other thread where people talk about learnings are good. We should learn from experiments. And that's the public facing view that we should learn from experiments. But internally, the metrics and KPIs that are put on them are all about those activities and the wins and the ROI of experimentation. So I want to go back to this point about learnings, and then we'll come to ROI as well. But let's talk about learnings first. You mentioned learnings, a culture of learning. Learnings are important. But learnings on their own have inherently zero value, right? I could learn from an experiment and then move on to the next experiment, learn
Yeah.
from that and move on to the next experiment. But if those learnings aren't utilized in making strategic decisions for the business or informing how to move forward to the next test or to the next um, piece of whatever it is, or mitigating a risk, it's inherently useless. So the value of an experiment learning is zero, unless.
Totally agree. Experimentation is effectively insight generation. That's all. That's all it is. It's very reliable. We know from the hierarchy of evidence it's a very reliable method of insight generation, and it's probably the most reliable way that you can see causation between a change and customer behaviour. But actually, that data in many ways is no different from what you get out of GA4 or Adobe Analytics or one of your analytics tools. And all of that data has, in theory, zero value on its own. Yes, you can learn from it, but you're right, to your point, none of that adds value unless you do something with it. And I've been a BI analyst here for 10 years. Prior to that, I was an analyst at other companies. And the value of what BI do is always really difficult to quantify because actually we add no value if nobody listens to us. And that's really tricky how you quantify the value of that sort of stuff, and it probably brings us on to some of the ROI stuff. And I think Johnny mentioned in the previous version of this podcast that the reason experimentation is so loved by businesses is because you can link it to an ROI in a way that you can't a dashboard in Adobe Analytics or GA4.
Yeah.
So I think the point you make about learnings and the value of learnings, the value of actionable insight off the back of learnings or actions off the back of learnings is massively key. But I think we forget experimentation is actually quite similar to all that other insight in the same way because it's been marketed in this different way and you can see a tangible value on
Yeah.
it.
Now, putting aside the fact that the tangible value can also be quite illusory, right? It could be something that's extrapolated from one point to say, oh, we've made X in this time period, so we will make Y million over the course of the year. And
Oh
it's
yeah,
never
you just
really.
times it by 12 and you forget about any impact a new
Yeah.
item's had.
But I think that's also problematic because what that ends up doing is it causes what we call a trust gap between what stakeholders expect, they've been told is going to make this ROI. Right now, there's this other loop, there's this expectation from stakeholders that certain targets have to be met because that's what they've been told, and often by vendors that have been marketing this as revenue generation, money printing, right? Or you can run all these amazing experiments with it, but really those numbers could also mean nothing once you start looking deeper into it.
So there was famously a director that I used to work with, and we did an experiment, and the uplift was shockingly big. And as a BI analyst, if the numbers are far too low or far too high, then you dig in a little bit more, and you're really hesitant when you start quoting really, really big numbers to directors because there's a chance either you won't believe or you've done something wrong, right? And we ran an experiment, and some fairly small change had, I think it was a 2.5 million uplift. And the director quite rightly went, well, where's my 2.5 million? I don't see that in the numbers.
Yeah,
And if
yeah,
that's what that does, then we'll just carry on making that small change multiple times because
yeah,
that's how we're going to maximize our revenue. And I think
yeah.
that's a really good example of where sort of miscommunication a little bit, misunderstanding a little bit, misrepresentation as well on the experiment. Because there is a really dangerous trust element. People don't always trust big numbers, and then they're right to not trust big numbers because 9 times out of 10, if something was that big and that obvious, you would have seen it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this trust issue, I've started seeing this in so many companies over the last few years where you have this disconnect, right? The specialist level saying, yeah, we're running this amazing experimentation program, culture of experimentation. The senior leaders in the same company are making strategic decisions completely disconnected from what the experimentation teams are talking about. And there is this other aspect that when we talk about learnings, I think we need to be on the same page about this as well. So often what I see when people talk about communicating learnings, they talk about communicating these, I say communicating, presenting these massive PowerPoint decks or sending email newsletters and so on and so forth. And in that is essentially a lot of jargon that you and I could probably understand, but give it to a senior stakeholder and it just comes across as gibberish, right? So, what's your views on that?
I try and encourage, I do try and encourage learnings communicated rather than numbers, because I think there's a reliance when you're communicating numbers that people have, the context of those numbers, and also the data literate mindset to appreciate what it means. So a 2% uplift in conversion, well, what's that worth? And I think you lose that. Sometimes big numbers on pages with low traffic can look great, but
Mm.
actually mean a lot less than a small number on a page with a lot of traffic. So unless you understand contextually what all this means, then the numbers at times can be a little misleading. I think also it means people try and search for big numbers. So if the number that they got from the experiment wasn't quite big enough, dig in it a little bit and you'll find something which probably isn't statistically significant, but affected, 25 people on a Tuesday in Walsall or something crazy like that. And that's what's communicated. So
Yeah.
what I try and do is communicate learnings. Now, that's not as sexy when you're talking to directors. They don't necessarily want to hear that a certain type of customer interacts with a certain button more than another one does. They want to hear, yeah, that's great, but what was that worth? And effectively, you come round to the same problem. But I think across the business, it lands a lot better, because a 2.1% increase in conversion is not going to drive the action that you were referring to before. Whereas if you can conclusively say that actually this kind of customer prefers this to this kind of customer, you don't need the numbers. A load of teams can take that away and actionably do something with that in their plans.
Yeah.
So it's really focusing on that value, on that learning, sorry, which can lead to an actionable, well, an action off the back of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the action is the important thing over here because it's when I look at insights and learnings, um, as I said, there's this tendency for people to overcomplicate it. And it's
Yeah.
no fault of theirs. It's because they've been conditioned into reporting that way. Or I remember once speaking to someone, and they had to create these PowerPoint decks for every hands-on, all hands meeting, presenting all their experiments one slide at a time with the stats and the screenshots and everything. And I was like, why do you do it that way? Well, the stakeholder wants it. And do they read it after the presentation? Do they reference it? Do they use it in any way? No, it just goes into their drive gathering digital dust, right? So the challenge becomes then how do you make these insights, first of all, understandable by the wider organization, but more importantly, actionable? It should really drive that action.
So I think it comes from understanding what an organization is trying to achieve. Because I think quite easily we've fallen into the normal conversation there of velocity, and I've done these 15 experiments, and therefore when you go to a QBR, here is the 15 experiments we've done. And actually, there's probably minimal value in terms of the change. There's definitely minimum value to the person that the change is being communicated to, because next quarter you're going to do 15 other different experiments, probably shooting for different metrics. Holistically, you're doing very little impact.
Yeah.
And again, Johnny alluded to using experimentation as part of a broader learning process around the big features. Something that stuck with me that he said was, it's amazing how we'll change the color of a button, but over here we'll build this brand new feature which we didn't experiment on because it was a really important thing.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's the mindset we've got to get out of. And we've got to, experimentation is all about building confidence. So every learning you get from experiment goes into effectively a mirror board of learnings that help you towards this overarching goal or this overarching feature. And
yeah,
experimentation should be there alongside user research and user testing and heat map tools and your analytics tools, and really building that confidence.
yeah,
And that's where the learnings fits a lot more than the value. And again, it's that shift away from using experimentation as a way of learning about customers as this holistic goal, to doing X number of experiments, and here is all the results of them.
Yeah. I suppose velocity and ROI and those kind of like metrics were easier to sell. And I think people still struggle to get out of that thinking
Yeah.
because they still say, oh, yeah, velocity is still important. And look, I'm all for more experimentation to help you learn faster and learn more. But you can learn fast, you can learn as much with less number of experiments. The number of experiments should never be an indicator of a maturity or culture in an organization,
I,
according
th-
to
I,
me.
th- I think the only time it is, and I guess again, a booking.com is a great example of this. It shows that you have that methodology running through all the different teams, because
Yep.
the more you're doing means that it's accessible to more areas of the business. And
Sure.
in that, I can totally see how velocity in an individual team going from 5 experiments to a year to 10 experiments a year doesn't mean you are 50% better at experimentation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's never an indicator. But then that takes me back to the key point over here, which is there any ROI from experimentation?
There is as a piece of the puzzle. So I used to do a deck around product analytics, and I would give a picture of I'm giving away my secret here, but I'd give a picture of Blackpool, and you would obviously have Blackpool Tower, but
Yeah,
I'd leave a gap so that people could see the tower, and I'd get people to try and work out which city is this, trying to hope they'll guess Paris, because without that bit of the puzzle, then it looks like you know what I mean? As soon as you see the
yeah,
tower, I think it's Paris. And the point I'm trying to make is that these are all different bits of the jigsaw which go into that ROI piece. So
yeah,
when any company launches a feature, unless it is completely hippo led and somebody has woke up that morning and gone, we're going to do this for no reason other than they've had an idea, most businesses will use some sort of data, research, that sort of stuff. So the ROI on your feature is actually the ROI on the work on the feature, but all the ROI of the insight that drove you to that feature as well. And that's where experimentation sits. Experimentation is another piece in that jigsaw that helps you get the picture, which means that you get the most ROI from your feature. And that's
yeah,
where the ROI in experimentation is. But it's not a direct one-to-one
yeah.
correlation
That's the
experiment
hard part.
to think that's the tricky bit. And that's the bit we've, as Johnny mentioned, missold over the years, because to
Yeah,
sell experimentation, to sell anything, then it's really easy to walk into a company and go, right, this is going to get you X amount of ROI, because inevitably they're going to get a percentage of that ROI. And
yeah.
unfortunately, it's not as easy as that.
Absolutely. And I think with this ROI question, one of the things that I look at experimentation as well is it's a question, right? Should we even build this feature, or should
Yeah,
we even for moving out of product, should we even go into this market? Should we even improve our operations in a certain way or the other way, right? It's a
I think
question that ultimately is going to give you an indicator. What you do with that indicator is up to you. Like the senior leadership can use it to make decisions.
I think one of my favorite examples of experimentation being used, I think it was a Chinese company who were basically looking at when people should come in the office. And
Right.
that they set up an A/B test of people coming in Tuesday, Thursday, or Wednesday, Friday. And I just loved that as a use case of experimentation, because when you take it away from the product sphere, where it is literally being used as, I have put this live, what value was it worth?
Yeah.
Then it's much easier to see it as a learning process. And no doubt from those learnings, there will have been an ROI off the back of the decisions that they will have made on when to open the office and things like that. And I
Yeah.
just thought it was a great example of using experimentation as learning, and a lot easier to not misconstrue in the way you see a lot of examples online.
Absolutely. And I think there's quite a big focus on online experimentation, right? Because it's easier to deploy and easier to sell tools like the testing vendors do. But experimentation as a capability, as an asset, is so much more useful when it's applied to all other areas of business as well. I mean, even online for that matter, there's your online channels where experiments are happening. But I can tell you that the product teams don't have any visibility of those things, or they don't know what another marketing team is doing, or yeah, so on and
Do,
so forth.
do you think that in these days we have the attention span for experimentation properly? I mean, we live in a world that's social media. We want things to be turned around in a week or 2 weeks. We want to get results as quickly as possible so we can shout about what we've done. And I know
Yeah.
that there's examples out there of people running long-term experiments, looking at lifetime value over 6 months to 3 years. There's going to
Yeah.
be great examples of holdout groups, etc. But I wonder how much we're driven into this world of we've made this change now. We can get ratification on how good we were within
Yeah.
a 2 week period. And that feeds into, like, when we think about how these originally started as print experiments back in the
Mm.
50s and 60s, like,
Yeah.
attention span genuinely was a bit longer then because there was none of this sort of stuff. And I think
Absolutely.
it's natural that experimentation evolves in that way, that we can do things quickly, so we want to get results quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's more that quick is fine, but we talked about those guardrails earlier, right? You don't want people running quick, but in the wrong direction, because that's also something. I looked at this case recently where a company, it's their experimentation program was IT driven. So their IT team had set up all the infrastructure, and they were running experiments where they had 200 data points for each experiment. And
Wow.
what the analysts were doing then was they were picking the metrics, as you said, a mobile user on a Tuesday afternoon looked good. And because they were tracking all those metrics, they were able to pick the metrics that best suited what was being asked of them, right? And I think there is also the danger because, again, we're kind of going through this loop. And I bring testing vendors into the picture again because what started off in 2010 or 2009 even, how easy it was to run tests, WYSIWYG tests, right? Let's run WYSIWYG tests. Then WYSIWYG tests were like, okay, we shouldn't do that. We should go to server-side testing. And all of a sudden, server-side testing became this big thing that you need to do. And it was more complicated. And now we're going slightly into an AI direction, like just prompt and you'll run experiments really quickly and really fast. And every time I look at it, the focus is always on velocity.
Yeah.
But it's never about how do we ensure that this capability that we have is actually well suited for the people running it, right? So the people that have the keys to or that have the guns in the Wild West, they know how to use it rather than it just being everyone given access without proper capabilities. Because then you've got lots of experiments and half of them are in the wrong direction.
I mean, where's your safety catch? To use the gun analogy,
Yeah.
in in a lot of tools, you can just enter a hypothesis. It doesn't matter what you put in there.
Yeah.
You can just enter a hypothesis, and I constantly try and remind people that in an experiment, you are trying to prove or disprove a hypothesis. You are not
Yes.
putting something live and then seeing what moves, which, back to your 200 metric, something will probably move.
Yeah.
Trying to hone in on that single metric. And I'm not saying you don't look at other guardrails and secondaries, but trying to hone in on that single metric and trying to prove or disprove that hypothesis is super important for all of this stuff. And
Yeah.
yet, how many of the tools out there are making sure the hypothesis is really good and enabling good hypothesis as much as they are enabling fast experiments?
Yeah, it's actually one of the it's one of the reasons that in Efestra we've been deliberate about grading the hypothesis as part of our health scores for our customers. And then the second thing is ensuring that even before the experiment is run, what we call as a decision protocol is made. So understanding that if I launch this test, first of all, I have to have a solid hypothesis and it checks whether the goals are defined clearly, do they match up with the hypothesis. The decision protocol is really important because that's one factor I feel that before I launch this experiment and analyze it, I should know that based on my hypothesis, if this test is validated slash wins, what I'm going to do on the back of that, right? Implemented, not implemented, whatever. If it's not validated, what do I do? Do I iterate on it? Do I just scrap the idea? And then the last bit is if there's no significant change, What do I do? Because that itself gets people focused on what will happen, what will I do if the test is validated, not validated, or insignificant. It removes their thinking about it needs to win by any, by a hook or a crook. It has to win. And the other thing we've done is shifted the naming convention slightly. So previously, success, unsuccessful, inconclusive, to the semantics around the hypothesis has been validated, not validated, or invalidated, and there's no significant change to it. So just that shift in itself, that's one thing we've been really conscious about, because ultimately it doesn't matter like how many experiments you run. The quality aspect of that is really key to determining which ones are useful enough in looking at for learnings and insights, and which ones aren't.
And I have seen experiments where a variant has won and it's never been rolled out. And I've
Yeah,
done piece of analysis, or I've had requests over the years where you're being asked something, and I genuinely reply with, well, if we prove this, are you going to be able to do anything off the back of this? And
yeah.
it's a really interesting point you make about that decision process off the back of an experiment or analysis.
I think that needs to happen before the experiment even goes live, because what that does is you're thinking through experiment design rather than it just being, we're launching an experiment. So many years ago, uh, before the conversion rate optimization crowd and experimentation and stuff, I was involved in the Lean Startup group in Manchester. I ran the Lean Startup group, and I also mentored at some startup weekends that they used to have back in the day, which used to happen on the weekends. And I remember one of the editions when I was looking at, the build, measure, learn loop of Eric Ries's Lean Startup was quite a big thing, and it kind of naturally lends itself to what experimentation is. But the teams that came together, they were coming up with business ideas and trying to validate it and so on and so forth. So I remember one particular example. It was a B2B idea. And they were like, we're going to call up some businesses and we're going to check if they respond favorably to our idea or not. And I was like, firstly, it's the weekend and you're not going to get in touch with anyone. So by looking at that small little piece of your experiment design, it's already failing, right? And I think this is, in a way, it highlights that what's been happening in our industry is loads of people have had training of some sort, certifications of some sort, but they don't have anyone kind of peer reviewing and saying, hey, your experiment might not actually meet the standards of what we expect.
Or just common sense elements. I mean, you've talked there about the importance of experiment design, and I alluded previously on doing experiments on places with very low traffic, and little things like that are so important to think about because again, if you go into the Wild West with these guns and you don't know what you're doing, then you're probably not going to get a result within any sort of short time frame for an experiment like that. And
Yeah,
then it leads to disappointment, and understanding the process right from design all the way through. And I'm not saying you need to be really statistically coherent and understand p-values and all that sort of stuff, but
yeah,
understanding the basics is really important. And that brings in a more holistic idea of how much you understand the customer and how much you understand the product that you are experimenting on. Because
yeah,
if you don't have a base understanding of what you're trying to shift, where you're trying to shift it, who you're trying to shift it for, then there's a good chance your experiment is not going to be great.
yeah,
And it feeds into that idea of sort of shit at a wall, see what sticks, see what moves.
yeah,
And I'm not going to say they're bad experiments, but the more, back to the evidence point, the more evidence you've got before you do an experiment, the more chance you're going to succeed, the more chance you're going to get learnings from it. It's all about holistic learning, understanding all of the things that are going on to be able to test something that's really impactful.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that is that awareness of it. In terms of the analysts themselves, I know we talked about them communicating learnings to the senior stakeholders. And I often wonder whether sometimes we're asking too much of different people to be different things. Like an analyst, for example, Like I know our devs, some of them love just coding away. They don't like, well, they don't even like meetings sometimes because it takes them away from it. So are we trying to get people that are naturally creative in the experimentation space or naturally analytical? And are we trying to get them to do things that they're, I wouldn't say not comfortable with, but they would need to be upskilled to a different level to know how to communicate at the senior level?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting, guess, crossroads at the moment, because if you've got tools like EPO and StatSig that can do your analysis for you, then you don't need the analyst to necessarily communicate those learnings. That's going to sit with a product manager, a marketing manager, whoever's conducting the experiment. And they're probably more au fait with the idea of communicating around the business and doing it in a way that is engaging for other people because they're trained in making sure their idea gets out there, speaking to senior leadership, stuff like that. Um, the analysts in my team, I'm not going to say they're all stuck in dark rooms with SQL code and that's where they're happiest, but I think it's an interesting sort of crossover of skill set to be able to be a good communicator, a good presenter, and a good analyst.
Yeah,
I think it's different parts of the brain and all that sort of psychology stuff.
yeah,
So that's tricky to find. But I think effectively we need those people at the moment in the CRO space to be able to do that cultural upskilling for the product teams and the experimenters so that they
yeah,
can go and use your EPOs, your StatSig. Because they, I think people can be taught in however you do it, and there are ways to teach complicated concepts quite easily. People
yeah,
can be taught the basic methodology without having to worry about the statistics. And I think teaching people who are running experiments that basic methodology is the way forward, because I don't think you're ever going to get a wave of product managers, marketing managers who are going to delve into SQL, start learning about p-values and be doing
yeah,
t-tests. You know,
yeah,
so I think it's an interesting crossroads into what you need in those space from the CRO experimentation lead kind of functions that I've come across. Then you do have people who are more talkers and communicators than statisticians. They rely on data scientists, they rely on tools, and that's what
yeah,
you see in that space. That's what I think we need in that space.
yeah.
So that's probably where it's going.
Got it. Well, a year from now, if we were to grab a drink together, how do you envision the industry moving forward or backwards? What's your take on it?
I mean, AI is going to make everything super easy for us, right? That's
Will we run
certainly
more tests with it?
well. That's yeah. I was going to say, what does super easy equate to? I think everyone's latching onto AI, and some of it I think will be horrific, and some of it will be brilliant. I've seen some great examples of AI looking at prioritization frameworks and being able to collate learnings so that it can genuinely have a place in discovery. And I think it's really exciting what AI can do in terms of pulling together learnings from different places. But I think there is a danger that as we try and go faster with AI, what we try and do is go faster and do more experiments. And the same
Yeah,
companies that are doing 10 bad experiments now can do 100 bad experiments because they've got AI in there somewhere. So
yeah,
I think if we can focus on the learning side, let the people do the thinking and AI do the working,
yeah.
then that's probably where we want to be in a year's time, where we're using it as a genuinely powerful discovery tool.
Well, I like the topic of this conversation. We started with rejecting this culture of experimentation. We talked about more about learnings as the real key driver in all of this. And Mark, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your insights. If anyone wants to find you online, how do they find you? How do they get in touch, connect with you?
I am on LinkedIn, and there's also the Experimentation North page as well on LinkedIn, which is definitely worth checking out.
How often do you run Experimentation North? Where are the meetups happening?
They happen. The Flutter have got a fantastic office in Leeds, so we host them in Leeds and alternate between Leeds and Manchester. We've got, I think, 4 more happening this year. So on the 31st of July, we've got our next Experimentation North event in Leeds. We've got some fantastic speakers. We've got somebody from Launch Darkly coming, and Emma Travis from Spiro, UX researcher from Spiro, ironically talking about AI, bearing in mind where we finished our conversation. And then we've got an event in Manchester in September and 2 more in Leeds. So do keep a lookout on LinkedIn for those events.
Perfect. Thank you again, Mark, and thanks for joining today's show.
Thank you for your time, Manuel. Speak to you soon.
So that's it for this episode of Breaking the Echo Chamber. If today's conversation highlighted gaps in the way your organization approaches experimentation, you're not alone. At Efestra, we've built the systematic governance platform that ensures that your experiments actually drive strategic decisions, not just more data. We help experimentation leaders move beyond the chaos of disconnected tools and fragmented insights to build programs that scale sustainably and deliver what matters most, strategic business decisions at the highest level. So check us out at efestra.com to see how we're helping organizations close the trust gap between experimentation promises and business reality. Until next time, my name is Manuel da Costa, the founder of Efestra. Keep questioning the noise.